Good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Joe Eggers. I am the Interim Director for the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Before I begin today, I want to acknowledge the Center and the University of Minnesota are on the ancestral lands of the Dakota people, and that this is a layered and complex history. This small acknowledgement, though, is one of many ways our center is committed to recognizing, supporting, and advocating for the rights of our Native American neighbors and colleagues. And before I turn it over to today's moderator, I want to just say how excited a program like this is for me. Really, the impact of literature and poetry can have on reflections and memories of past trauma. And poetry itself allows us to both process painful events and celebrate our collective resilience. And I really want to thank Michael today for planting the bug about a program like this. So with that, I want to introduce today's moderator, Michael Winnikoff. From 2015 to 2023, Michael Winnikoff ran the University of Minnesota Science Communications Lab, a collective interdisciplinary internship program for writers, scientists, artists, and designers. He is active in the biodesign community, mentoring student teams in the International Biodesign Challenge, and leading the student-faculty team whose Fair Farms project was named runner-up in the 2022 Biodesign Sprint. As a visual artist, writer, designer, Michael's play, The Botanist's Wife, appeared at the Minnesota Fringe Festival. He's been a guest instructor at the Alfred School of Art and Design, where he taught a freshman foundation studio. Michael is the principal at Holland Snow Studio, a public interest design firm whose clients include the Aspen Institute, the Soros Foundation's Open Society Institute, and the Arts for Justice Initiative and the Treatment Action Group. He is a current educator, fortunately for us, at the Center for Holocaust and Education, a fellow in Holocaust and Genocide. I'm sorry, I am now, he's an education fellow at the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, when I'm fortunate to call him a colleague, and a fellow at the Institute on the Environment. And before I formally turn it over to Michael, I'd like to, Michael, invite you to share some of your own work. I think I'm very inspired to have three phenomenal poets and artists here with me today, and I think, Michael, we'd be remiss if we didn't invite you to do the same. Thank you. Michael, you are muted.
Thanks. Okay, so I'll start again. And I wanted to start by welcoming everybody and tell you how excited I am to bring this conversation together after, I think, nearly 2 years of conversations, beginning with Grzegorz, then Joe, and finally Jephta, about the power that poetry can have to help people, and in my case, to help students engage in very difficult topics around genocide and violence and human nature. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction, then I'm going to introduce our two poets. In between, I'll read a poem I wrote last year when I was traveling, in part to visit Grzegorz. And then we're going to have a bit of a poetry reading, but also a kind of an open-ended discussion. And we would love to have members of the audience to participate by asking questions or even commenting on things that they've heard or thoughts that they've brought to the table. So in preparing for today's event, I was reading Susan Sontag's Regarding the Pain of Others, which was published in 2003, looking for guidance in thinking through our relationship to suffering, to genocide, and the privilege, if I can use that word, of witnessing these events from a geographical and historic distance. As Sontag points out, much of our experience, and our experience, I think we have to qualify by saying people in privileged positions, is mediated through images, which we can choose to confront or ignore. Either way, we're often at a loss when it comes to engaging with such difficult subject matter. And Sontag quotes the American novelist Henry James, who in 1915 wrote of World War I. One finds in the midst of all this, as hard to apply one's words as it is to endure one's thoughts. The war has used up words. They have weakened. They have deteriorated. And I have to say that I find this feeling really relatable. The idea that it's hard to endure one's thoughts. It's hard to endure what one experiences in the world. But one of the things that I love so much about the poetry that Grzegorz and Jephta have brought into the world is the power of words and of poetry to reopen a path to engagement, to contemplation and to self-reflection. And in fact, it was Grzegorz's poetry and a visit to Poland last year that inspired me to rethink my relationship to writing and to poetry, and it opened a new window for me to re-engage with poetry, which I'd set aside for a long time. And these lovely people were kind enough to invite me to read a poem or two of mine. And so I want to read something that I wrote last fall when I was traveling in Salzburg on a beautiful sunny day, when I was experiencing the city in many ways, but I was also becoming increasingly aware of the tragedy unfolding in Gaza, and trying to wrestle with my relationship to the past, my relationship to the present, and what remnants of the past bring to our understanding of our current situation. So this poem is called Salzburg Underfoot. Of the many rhythms marking life in the great city of Mozart, Anavitium of 2 Krotachstrasse will miss most. The steady syncopation of horse carts and children skipping, the dim echoes of voices up the lane, the chorus of bombs falling, and yes, of course, the sound of cobblestones underfoot. After the war, she will miss the clearing of rubble where houses once stood, the arrival in 1962-61 of the birdcatcher, a statue cast in bronze to fill the void left by history and memory, which was kind to Mozart, but less so to Anna Witzum, 40, incurable, who left Strasbourg in the spring of 1941 for Hartheim, palace of no return. Though not without the help of others. So perhaps we should mention those names too, in the same breath, for the sake of history. Rainer, Hauser, and the doctors Wolfer, as we stumble past 2 Krotachstrasse, where in place of a single paving stone, Anna Witzum is remembered in bronze, underfoot. And as many of you who have traveled in Europe know, that there are, in place of cobblestones, bronze commemorative markers for people who were killed during the war. And this one particularly struck me because my expectation was that this would have been a Jewish person who was, persecuted. But in fact, this was much earlier in the war, when people who were incapacitated, either mentally or physically, were also being selected for fates that were unkind. Thank you very much for letting me read that. I'm happy to comment on it later in the program if that's helpful at all. But let me now introduce our two poets. Grzegorz Kwiatkowski is a Polish poet, musician, activist, and scholar. His art revolves around the subject of history, remembrance, and ethics. He is a member of PEN America and the European Literature Network Versopolis. He plays in the psychedelic rock band Trupa Trupa, whose music has been released by international labels like Sub Pop and Glitterbeat Records. With the band, he recorded sessions for NPR's Tiny Desk, yes, you can find it online, and BBC Radio 6. He co-hosts the Virus of Hate workshop at the University of Oxford and has been a guest lecturer and renowned universities such as the University of California, Berkeley, Stanford, Yale, UCLA, Johns Hopkins, University of Chicago, Northwestern, and the Jewish Theological Seminary. Collaborating with UCLA's Vina Lal, he initiated the Sangam and Agora, a forum for poets, philosophers, scholars, and autodidacts. And with Paul Lodge from the University of Oxford, he co-founded It Sings, Therefore We Are, Philosophy and Music in Conversation. He participates in the Surviving Memory in Post-War El Salvador, a collaborative research initiative And as an activist, Kwiatkowski has dedicated to preserving Jewish heritage in Poland, notably the once forgotten Jewish ghetto in Gdansk, which is now commemorated. You can find more about his work at grzegorz.com. Our second poet, Jephta Nguherimo, is a lifelong activist, poet, and former professional labor negotiator of Herero descent based in the US. He is founding member of the Ova Herero People's Memorial and Reconstruction Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing the struggle of restorative justice for the Ova Herero people. Jephta was among the organizers of the exchanges that eventually forced the German government to confront and acknowledge Germany's genocide of the Ova Herero and Nama people in 1904 and 1908. He has led conversations and presented talks on restorative justice and memory culture at various international conferences, including the Reparations and Racial Healing Summit in Accra in 2022 and the first session of the UN's Permanent Forum of People of African Descent in Geneva in 2022. As a writer and poet, he has also published several articles on the struggle for recognition in Namibian and German presses. He is the author of a book of poetry entitled Unburied Unmarked, The Untold Namibian Story of the Victims of German Genocide between 1904 and 1908. And he was featured in the documentary by Al Jazeera entitled Namibia, The Price of Genocide. So with those introductions, I would like to invite these two gentlemen to talk to you a little bit, both about their relationship to history, to poetry, and to activism, and by all means to share some poetry. And just by order of who appeared first on the flyer, we're going to start with Grzegorz and then move into conversation after the two of them have their chance to present. So welcome to you both, and thank you for being here.
Hello, dear Michael. Hello, dear Jephta. Hello, dear Joe. We can see you, but you are the main organizer of this event, this moral miracle. I hope so. And dear guests, it's great to meet you. Yeah, it's my first time on your great university in Zoom mode, but still I'm very excited. And I was once in your beautiful city. I played with my band in the 7th entry. Am I correct? Is there
7th Street
kind of
entry.
a club?
Yeah.
7th band?
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So I'm very thankful. I loved the introduction by Michael, and I loved the poem by Michael. Michael is a really brilliant poet, and I'm not exaggerating. And the introduction part I loved most. This thing about words. I mean, that I really believe in the power of words. I mean that I live. For me, words means communication, and for me, words means human beings. For me, it's like the same. I mean, when I'm saying apple, I'm just seeing an apple, or I can even taste it. I mean that for me, words are objects and human beings, and I really fight for reality of words, and that's why I really believe in poetry. So I would love to share with you a few poems from my book called Crops, translated by Peter Constantine. And if you don't mind, we'll read it with Michael. A few poems in English. First one, you are starting or I'm starting? What do you think, Michael?
You're starting with crops, I believe, and then I'm going to move on, and we'll alternate from there.
Okay, so the first poem is called Crops. Crops, our real farm work, not killing. Although I admit the massacres in the swamps have the rhythm of our seasonal labor, and when the rains were heavy, we did not go out for crops.
Roger Tans, during the war, we laid out bodies like wood. But after the war, we laid out wood in the forest, like bodies freshly felled.
World, I went with my child to the forest and tried helplessly with him. Tears dripped from my eyes, and the child wiped them away with his hand, and I so regretted that I had brought him into the world.
Walter Steyer, my father, a decent office worker in the railways, never took place in any of the shootings. He was just doing his job, organizing transports eastward and westward, north and south, back and forth.
Karl-Heinz M. I was 14 years old. I was sterilized because I couldn't tell the difference between a brook and a stream, between steps and stairs.
Simon Schwebnik. I didn't believe I would return to Poland ever again, to Chełmno, and that I would stand here where they killed me. No, no, no.
Ernst Junger. War has let me down. Modern war has not met my expectations. It didn't live up to its literary ideal. For example, there were no horses. Thank you.
Let me just make a quick comment about crops. I'll hold up the book, which is probably in reverse on your screens, but it was published here in Minnesota, the translation by Rain Taxi, a local poetry organization, and you can buy that book from them. But I think we have a great honor of being the city where Grzegorz was first published in English. So.
To be fully truly, I forgot about it. I mean, yeah, Rain Taxi is from Minneapolis. You're totally right. I mean, I'm very, very thankful, not only because of being on at your great university, but Rain Taxi for me, it was like a game changer. I mean, that Stephen Larsen and Eric and the whole Rain Taxi Society, they published this little book, and it helped me in a big way. It helped me in spreading this anti-hatred message, because my poetry is, well, it's anti-hatred message. That's the point.
So let's shift gears briefly and have Jephta talk a little bit about read some poetry, talk a little bit about his work. And then I think it'd be helpful if each of you talked a little bit about the personal and historical connections, the family connections you have to each of these events that have become such important themes in your work.
Okay.
Sorry, I have a little bit of cough, but I think I'll manage to talk. And thank you very much for reading your work, Greg, and both of you, and for inviting Joe to be part of this very important event. You read my bio, of course, and a brief synopsis is the history of the genocide against the Ovaherero and Nama people was not well known to the international world. But even though it was not well known, it was, and it still remains a part of our memory culture, meaning Ovaherero and Nama people. And so my work is based on that transmission of knowledge from my great grandparents who passed on, and not necessarily because there's horror stories about the genocide, but there's also survival stories. But at the same time, it's a work about pains. But when you come to Namibia, because you will talk about the landscape, because the landscape also carries its own pain. Because of the people who suffered or who ran through through the desert and through the sea. I mean, all this stuff. So it's a very simple but yet complex history. And for after the war or after the genocide, what they call it, our people were not really allowed to tell the story, and so therefore they transmitted those stories through what they call omihiva, meaning like dance, male dance and women dances. But they will talk about, they may be singing about a horse or a cow, but has always been a metaphor for something else about the war and the flight and the resistance of our people. So I started this work. I wanted to be a filmmaker, but in the process, I parked the project aside and said, like, well, but then one day the work of poetry came just, I would say, naturally. And my first poem that I wrote, I visited one of the sites of the concentration camp, former concentration camp, the place called Swakopmund. And for many years, it's just an entertainment. I mean, it's the resort area for the Germans, and particularly it's a little German town. But there are graves of those who perished on the concentration camps, but they were not known. And so some people, because their burial was mass graves of people, and some people were thrown into the sea. And so when I slept one night, and I just received the voices of I will have to say, my ancestors or my forefathers, and I wrote the poem titled, "The Sea Can't Swallow Me." My bones resting at sea bottom, fish feast on my flesh. You thought I will be forgotten, but the salt of the sea keeps my bones fresh. The sea can't swallow me. The sea and I are one. One bright day, the waves will wash my bones ashore. In my children's memory, I stay. The sea can't swallow me. The sea and I are one. So that's my first poem that I ever written, and everything from there came out of that experience. And it's just the salt of the sea and the smell of the sea. And sometimes we talk about history, and we think it's something that passed, but there's a living history, even the spaces. About the poem you read in Germany, there's always a reminder, but sometimes we tend to ignore the reminder that the spaces we are touching and we're walking on are sacred, or they have a story to tell.
Thank you. It's a beautiful poem. It would be helpful, I think, for the audience to know a little bit about your connections through family to these two very different genocides, and also a comment that came up in an earlier conversation, Grzegorz, about a new connection you made geographically between Kaiser Wilhelm and the Herero genocide in 1904. So why don't we start by you telling that story as a gateway to sort of your connection to the events in World War II and the locations around Gdansk where these things took place. And then we can talk a little bit about Namibia as well.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I think that for me, yeah, issue of family roots are. This is the key point of my poetry and my art, because I'm also a musician and I'm also an activist. I'm making, to be fully true, a lot of things. But the point is that I'm from Gdańsk, Poland. So Gdańsk is in the north of Poland. It's by the beautiful Baltic Sea. But the point is that Gdańsk is the city where the Second World War started. So very, very tragic events, maybe one of the most tragic events in the whole world's history. On the other hand, Gdańsk is the city where the solidarity worker movement started in the 70s. And because of these solidarity worker movements, we crushed the communism regime in 80s and at the beginning of 90s. So it was like a big revolution of hope. And it was a very great pacifistic movement. So Gdańsk is a city of tragedy, pessimism, because of also the great pessimistic philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer was born in Gdańsk, but it's also a city of hope. So the point is that my grandfather was a prisoner of a concentration camp Stutthof, which is located 30 kilometers from Gdańsk. So he was from Gdańsk. He was imprisoned in Stutthof during the Second World War. His experience broke his life. He was a traumatized person, very, very calm, very broken. And in some way, he gave me this experience in a very literary way, because when I was a child, when I was 9 years old, he invited me on a visit to Stutthof concentration camp, to the museum. So I went there with him as a child, and it was his first visit after the Second World War. So he was suddenly, when he entered the museum, he was starting to shouting, screaming, crying. So he was in an immediate state of trauma. And of course, when I was very small, I didn't know what was the point. But actually, I'm very grateful. I'm very thankful for what he did for me. And so in the concentration camp, he was responsible for carrying dead bodies from the camp hospital. Later, by the way, when he was released from this concentration camp, he was forced to be a Wehrmacht soldier. And as a Wehrmacht soldier, he carried a dead body, victims of Allied bombings in Dresden and in Hamburg. So it's even more complicated, because suddenly he was in a uniform of people who tortured him, right? Very, very complicated in a psychological way. On the other hand, the family of my wife is a Jewish family. So my wife, her grandmother was hiding in the forest during the Second World War, and it was a family secret. Their Jewish heritage, their roots. So in some way, my poetry, as well as my activism, as well as my life, is connected to the process of uncovering. I'm very often, I think I've got a talent to uncovering things, and I think I've got a talent to recognize when someone's lying and when something is wrong with words, because I really believe in the reality of words. Yeah, so one of the biggest genocides in the history of world, so Holocaust, took place on these Polish lands, and I think that these ghosts from the past are really still present. And I think that some of the artists are like sponges, and I think I'm this kind of artist who is very open on these ghosts. Just to say about a strange accident 2 years ago. By an accident, I found my grandfather's camp notes, and I didn't speak with my grandfather when he was alive. Almost, I mean, that very rare we talked to each other. And suddenly 2 years ago, I found out that my poems are the same, pretty the same in 99% as his camp notes. And I show it to my international translators, and they thought that I'm joking, or they thought that I prepared these camp notes. I mean, that they thought that I was the author, because they didn't see the difference. So the genetic memory is a proven thing. So it's not more hypothesis. And I'm very great. I mean, that I think there is kind of a transmission of a generation trauma, but I don't think I'm a traumatized. I think I'm not traumatized at all. I think I'm a person who can make something good with this bad knowledge about human beings. I think about my art as something which is fighting with fighting with genocide, fighting with evil, by, for example, exposing lies and exposing very obscene events from the history of the world. Yeah, thank you.
Jephta, I think that's a great segue to your own relationship with your family history.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a great, I mean, the similarity, I mean, it's interesting. Thanks for sharing, Greg. And mine is storytelling. I started research work on the genocide from the academic or the technical point of view. And I went out to different communities and spoke to the different professors about the genocide, what they have written. But then one day I realized, like, Jesus, I haven't even sat down with my grandmother to ask, like, what does she know about it? Because I had assumed that the stories that she was telling a little bit was not really that relevant to my story. And then we sat down and we discussed, we talked a little bit. And in the middle of the conversation, I asked a simple question like, did you get to see your grandmother? And she said no. And at this point, she was like, her tone of voice, was down. I was like, so why? What happened? Well, I said, tell me what happened. When the people were fleeing, she was too old. I mean, she tried to catch up with the rest of the family, but at a certain point, she was too tired, and her brother told the kids, the two children, like, go ahead, I will try to help my sister. But at the end of the day, the brother joined the family, and the kids asked, like, where's my mom? And the brother said, well, I left her under a tree. And they asked, what do you mean? Well, we couldn't keep up. We are hungry. We are tired. And so my grandmothers asked, like, so you mean you left my mother under a tree to die? And uncle said, like, well, I'm sorry. So I have that image of the story that my great-grandmother was left under a tree to die. And so I always felt, I'm still thinking about, like, what happened and what was that last message to the kids. And so that trauma of that experience for my great grandma, that was great grandma, the great grandma who barely spoke a word to her children after that experience. So I wrote a poem titled "Left to Die Under a Tree," and I'm going to read only two verse. And it said, let me rest under the Omumborobonga tree. My body can no longer flee. My spirit and soul will persist, will embody the spirit of generations to resist. Run before they capture you. Run and conquer the Kalahari Desert as they have the might to pursue. Her wind, cold, and your thirst remain undeterred. So this is basically my great-grandmother who was left under the tree to telling the children to run and not to be afraid to conquer the Kalahari Desert because they went through the desert, because it's cold, windy, and a lot of people died of thirst. So my relationship to that is the stories, the transmission of those family stories, and not necessarily that, but also stories that I read from oral accounts, what happened during the concentration camps and the rape of women and children dying and everything. And at the same time, my work is also contemporary in the sense that I'm an activist. And so some of my poetry speaks to the Germans not to be afraid to apologize, not to be afraid to ask for formal apology. And so it's more like a complex contemporary history, not history, demands of the people as well as the suffering of the people. And so that's my relationship to this work.
It's a very powerful poem, and I'd encourage people, if they have the chance to actually get a hold of the book and read the full poem, to do so. It seems to me that there's a very personal aspect to this poem that I imagine helped you to connect and to reconcile your own feelings and your relationship with your grandmother. Can you talk a little bit about that personal, maybe healing or personal empowerment that the poetry provided you as?
Yeah, absolutely. When I wrote that, it was I wrote the whole book through the process, I think 3 months or 6 months. Through the help of many people helping me with editing my work and read through them. And after I read that, I felt like I have just released like this emotional burden that I had carried, that now I can speak with the sound about the subject of the genocide, but I speak it with ease and with the understanding that there is still pain, but I have released it through my work. And when I speak to my friends or family, when they talk about the same subject, I always recognize, oh, that's a poetry that I wrote, but I wish that I can share that work with them. And maybe one day will be translated in my language. But poetry is a form of expressing my pains, especially my intense anger And I recently visited this site called the Shark Island, which was a very notorious concentration camps in the south of Namibia. And the space is a now recreation area, and it's where my grandmother was held before they were transferred to another camp. But this recreation area, the Germans come and camp and set up campsites. So it's so painful still. But when I wrote, I wrote this poem that I'm still working on. It released some certain energy that it allows me now to fight my fight of activism and face the government official to rename or to respect the space. So that's the work, the power of poetry, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I'd like to throw this question out to either one of you who feel like you have an answer, but it's clear reading your poetry and listening to you speak that there is a kind of catharsis in being able to engage with the words, the histories that your family's experienced. What kind of reactions do you get when you work with young people or introduce young people who aren't aware of these events or don't have the personal connection? Does the poetry help awaken in them an ability to contemplate, an ability to talk, an ability to engage in a way that a simple history lesson or even a picture can't do? I think we've lost sound, Jephta. I think you're on mute.
I said, go ahead, Greg. I will.
Oh, okay.
As far as I understand, the question was about the communication with the youngest generation, right?
Yeah, and I'll just say that from my personal experience, I was raised on a lot of Holocaust education stories by survivors, visual imagery, but never given the chance to really process that as a young person. And so my hope is that poetry is an avenue into that exercise of processing the past and understanding.
Well, I think that usually not. I mean, the poetry of Jephta, for example, is extraordinary case of something like that. I think that most of poetry don't deals with this kind of stuff. I mean, there are a lot of poems about Holocaust and genocide, but I think it's different stuff. I mean that people have got different ideas about poetry and art. For example, my idea with poetry is, I created kind of a moral trap. I know that maybe it sounds cynical, but I think it's not. I mean that my poetry is constructed in such minimalistic way. These are like shreds. I mean, the fragments, and the point is that the reader is the one who is deciding about the real narration of these poems, which is super obscenic. I mean, the idea is very, very full of obscenity. Suddenly the reader is inside the genocide landscape where there are no good answers. Actually, there are only questions, and by taking the reader to such genocide territory, I think, especially the youngest readers, I think that most of them don't even know that these kind of things happened, and suddenly they are because this narration is so minimalistic, they have to put something from their insights to these poems, and suddenly they are inside the story. So this is the first thing, and the second thing is that when I was a young person, I was a coordinator of Amnesty International in the city of Gdańsk, and very fast I found out that the tragedies from the past and the Second World War, they are not only tragedies. The tragedies are all around. Year after year, we've got another genocides and another atrocities, another human rights violations, and I think that this, for example, okay, I'm talking in my poetry mostly about Second World War because I'm talking about my roots, but I think that I'm still talking about the crimes which are happening right now because of this minimalistic idea. So I think that if you will picture something in a precise, good way, even if it happened 200 years ago, if you picture it in a good way, then it works. You know what I mean? Because you picture the mechanism. So I think that, you know, I really believe in an art. I mean, that I believe in the therapeutic role of art, in the therapeutic role of literature, poetry, music. I believe that because of art, we can be better people. You know, I mean, it's amazing. I don't know any better mechanism and apparatus to change the reality than art. I think it's as important as politics. So it's not only about beauty, but of course, art has got this idea of entertainment. And because of this idea of entertainment, art, you know, you can spread the art, you know, all around because people like entertainment. And suddenly, you know, for example, they are reading a poetry and they think, oh, I will read a poetry about beauty and maybe it will be beautiful and great. And suddenly they are reading this kind of a stuff from Auschwitz. And I think, you know, it's like a trap, but I think, you know, I'm lucky to have a very good feedback from the readers. They weren't angry at me. You know, we are living in the times when more and more people think that the Holocaust didn't happen, and Auschwitz was like a science fiction story. So, you know.
Jeff,
I
I want
completely agree with you.
go ahead.
Let's go ahead. I mean, I get different reaction depending which of my poems they read. And most of them, they really appreciate the work. And the most I get about is one of my poem called No Shame, because for many years, one of the things that most people who are not, or one of the impact of the genocide on generations, second or third or fourth, fifth generation, is the shame of having been your tribe, having been experienced that. There is that shame. And that shame also was exacerbated, enhanced by the German government political position that these things happened so many years ago. And so there is no point of rehearsing history. And when they read my poem, and it's only one line, I said, like, my story is not old, it is being told. My story is not history, it is about the burden of memory. And so when they read that, they say, like, it inspires them to speak up about things that they know. So it affects, I get a good reaction from that. But as I said, my work has not been yet translated into my native language. So, but I do carry stories with them when I talk relating to the poetry.
Thanks. Those are lovely responses to the question. I think this would be a great time to open it up to members of the audience who might have questions. And Joe, if you're there and can help us mediate that process, we can put the questions in chat if everybody has access to the chat, or open up to screens if that's possible.
Yeah, so there are two ways we can do this. First, and I think the preferable way for everyone is if you're willing to raise your hand and we can unmute you and have you ask your question or turn on your camera. And if you're not comfortable with that, I mean, this is a recorded session. You can also include a question in the chat box, and Michael and I can make sure it gets relayed.
So we'll give people a few minutes to sort of think through questions they might have. So in the meantime, I'll throw something else at the two of you, and we can come back to people's questions. I'm not seeing anybody, Joe, but if you have a different view of the audience.
I do. I see Joachim has a question. So Joachim, if you'd like to.
Yeah. I think we've got not a lot of time, so let's jump into the questions.
Yeah.
If you don't mind.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So thank you very much for these moving presentations. I have two questions. First question, is there is a long history of poetry pertaining to mass violence. I think of Armenian literature, I think of post-Holocaust literature following right soon after the end of World War II. And my question is, if we were inspired, and if so, by any particular poets or writers from that earlier generation of poets who responded to the experience of the Holocaust or the Armenian genocide, for that matter. And the second question is, why poetry? Why not prose? Whom do you reach through poetry? What can you achieve that you cannot achieve by writing prose about the processing of those experiences? So I look forward to hearing your answers, or maybe one answer to one of my questions.
I can tell you, I mean, that firstly, thank you for this question. Secondly, you're right, there were a lot of literatures. I think that maybe I sound like ignorant because I said that there was not a lot of stuff focused on the genocide and Holocaust. There was a lot. I just thought that it wasn't done in this way. For example, you know, I respect and in some way admire Paul Celan, but it doesn't give me an answer I need. I mean that, you know, because for me, the main thing for me about art is that art is helping us to be better human beings. And for me, we can be human beings if we will find out about our murderer, about our potential to kill each other, right? I mean that if we will find out that we are firstly people who are responsible, secondly that we can do harm to our brothers and sisters, then something good can happen with us, right? So for me, art is like a mirror. And actually, for example, my poetry is based on American literature, on Edgar Lee Masters' book. He was an American poet based in Chicago. So Edgar Lee Masters wrote Spoon River Anthology, and for me, this Spoon River Anthology is one of the most important books. On the other hand, when I'm thinking about the Shoah theory, I'm thinking about books, but I'm thinking about movies. I'm thinking about great documentary Shoah by Claude Lanzmann. So these are my artistic, let's say, artistic and documentary roots. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I have to make a qualification that before my first poem, I wrote it in 2019. So I'm not I just happen to write poetry, but I have read a lot of African poets, like writers like Holsu Yenga and from Nigeria. So, and even in the absence of that, our own tradition is full of poetry and poems, and whatever they say is always truncated or said in a manner that one has to dissect the meaning of that. As I said, someone could be singing or talking about a man with a big hat and on a white horse, and it took a while to me to ask, like, what do they mean really? What's the meaning of that? And only few people in the poets and historian or orators or griots will have the knowledge to do that. So my time with spent with the griots of my culture and in Namibia helped me to conceptualize or try to tell this story in a different manner. Everybody's making a movie. Everybody was making, a documentary film, and everybody was talking about it orally. But oral tradition is dying. And so I think poetry will die, but I think but also it will remain in the shelves for a long time. And so, and as I said, I didn't plan to write it. It just emerged when I experienced that in Swakopmund. The story came to me, and it came in that manner. So, and I think it helps because it also tells the stories in a short version as opposed to reading an entire book on the history. But so that's my perspective.
I thank you both very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. There is another person.
Kaya, I hope I'm saying that right. I'll invite you to ask your question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you so much for this beautiful presentations, and I think it's really like a beautiful dialogue and just important to have you two like presenting this together. And I'm a scholar of memory studies in Germany, from Germany, and Jephta maybe also collaborate on like some other projects and presentations. And we discussed a lot because in Germany, there's oftentimes like a thought of a rejection, like when you want to compare the memory of the Holocaust to the Ovaherero and Nama genocide. So my question is like, how do you two relate to each other's stories and poetry, and how does this like resonate with you and your memories and your own stories when you listen to like the others' poetry and storytelling and this painful personal family histories? So do you thank you.
I'm very thankful. I'm sorry for trying to give an answer as a first person, but because I didn't say very important thing, super important thing, because I live in a city, but Gdańsk was a post-German city. I live in a post-German city, and the point is that the last emperor of Germany and Prussia was one of the main responsible person for the genocide of Herero, right? And I didn't know about it. I 1 year ago I was on the countryside near Gdańsk, and I was in a beautiful palace in a place called Kadyny, and suddenly I found out that Kadyny was the summer palace of last emperor of Germany, and it's very probably that he made some orders. He gave some orders about these genocides in this place. So because of brilliant poetry of Jephta and because of his personality and story, I thought that I will fight in the future for some commemoration plaque in this place called Kadyny. I mean, tens of thousands of tourists are going every year to this place, and I think they should know that this, let's say, bloody emperor was there, and he was ordering genocide orders, and the people were dying. So it resonates in me in a big way, and I didn't know that Michael and Joe will have this idea to make this pairing with Jephta. So I feel very grateful, very thankful. Also, I'm more and more active in the commemoration issues. I was fighting for a commemoration of a Jewish ghetto in city of Gdańsk, and fighting for saving almost 500,000 pairs of shoes near the Schutzhof concentration camp, which belonged mainly to Jewish victims of Auschwitz. But example of Jephta is for me, like a example of a great poet and a great activist, fighting for a reparation, right, from Germany. And so, for me, this idea of pairing us together, for me, is like, I feel very grateful, very thankful, and it gives me a spiritual strength to move forward. So thank you for this question, and dear Jephta, thank you for a pleasure to know you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I think you answered it all, and I really do appreciate this event. And I met Joe during our exchange program in the US and Germany, and we discussed this. And Michael, I never had an opportunity to talk with you, but I also looking forward to read your books, Greg, and your story is very moving. And I think that the last time we had a gathering of Jewish community and Holocaust survivor and the Ovaherero people, we formed friendship, and we found legal practitioners to file a legal case against the German government in the US. So that was the culmination between me speaking with a Jewish person who's leading the Holocaust Center in New York. And so we connected our story, and they felt a sense of justice need to be done, and they organized that space to for us to tell our story. And so this is part of it, and I'm looking forward to read more of your work and collaborate further on this, because the stories are similar, even though they are not the same because of the distance. And some historians said that the Herero and Nama genocide was a dress rehearsal for the Holocaust that happened to Jewish people. And they say that simply because the great-grandchildren of those who participated in the genocide against Herero were active in the
Looks like we have a little technical problem, but I'm hoping
it's entanglement. It's entangled history given the perpetrator, and it's basically the same.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. We're running up against our time limit. I think if some of us want to stay a few more minutes, we can take one more question, but I realize that people are going to need to drift off to go other places. So again, just a reminder that Jephta's book can be purchased on Amazon, and it's well worth the effort and the read. And through Rain Taxi or through me, because I have a few copies, you can get a hold of Crops by Grzegorz. And again, I recommend them both.
Dear, I'm so sorry for interrupting you, but dear Michael, dear Joe, dear Jephta, and dear guest, one more time, I'm very, very thankful. And I think that, in my opinion, I don't want to, push you into my ideology, but I really think, as you know, the history is not the past. It's we are creating history all the time. Yesterday was a history. What I want to say is that we are responsible, more or less, for our actions, and I think that the art can change our souls. And you've got elections in November, right? This is a big task. I mean, and the whole world is waiting for this election. What I want to say is that we should have open hearts, open minds, and be and try to be as good as we can to other people, even if they've got different point of views, and even if sometimes they want to even cause us some harm. It's the most problematic thing. But anyway, we should try to communicate, try to protest, alert, and to be active and not to be afraid. I think we really can't be afraid, and I think that art is helping us not to be afraid and to speak about reality. Because talking about history is we are talking about reality, and talking about poetry is a really conversation about reality, politics, and everything really. Thank you.
Jephta, would you like to have the last word, and then we'll sort of unwind the day.
Yeah, no, I think the audience will the participation and for arranging the space, and I wouldn't say more than what Greg said, and appreciate the sharing of the ideas and exchange.
Thank you both for attending, and Joe for making the connections between the three of us and setting this up, and to the rest of the audience for taking the time out of your busy day to attend. I believe that the recording will be online soon, if you wanted to share with other folks. And feel free to reach out, at least to me, directly if you have any questions. And hopefully we'll do something like this again, or we'll have a chance to meet in person.
Great. Fingers crossed.